As night falls and the world grows quiet around you, we invite you on a journey back through time, to a place where the earth itself bore witness to one of history's longest and most grinding battles. This is the story of Verdun, a name that echoes through the corridors of the 20th century with a weight both terrible and profound. Over the course of 303 days, from February to December of 1916, the hills and valleys of northeastern France became the stage for a battle that would come to symbolize the entire First World War, a conflict that tested the limits of human endurance and transformed the very landscape into something unrecognizable. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, we will walk together through this history, not with urgency or alarm, but with the measured pace of reflection and remembrance. The Battle of Verdun was many things: a strategic calculation, a test of national will, a human tragedy of immense proportions. But it was also, in its way, a story of ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances, of soldiers who endured what seemed unendurable, of a piece of earth that absorbed the fury of modern warfare and somehow, eventually, found peace again. The number 303 is significant not merely for its length, though 10 months of continuous battle is remarkable by any measure. It represents something more: the relentless, grinding nature of industrialized warfare, where victory was measured not in swift maneuvers or decisive engagements, but in meters of muddy ground gained and lost again. It was a battle that both sides entered with clear objectives, yet neither achieved what they had intended. In this way, Verdun became a mirror reflecting the larger tragedy of the Great War itself. We will move through this story slowly, chronologically, allowing each phase of the battle to unfold at its own pace. There will be moments of tension, certainly, and accounts of great suffering, but these will be presented with respect and distance, as historical facts observed from the safety of more than a century's remove. Our purpose is not to shock or disturb your rest, but rather to help you understand, and perhaps, in understanding, to find a kind of peace with this difficult chapter of human history. The fields around Verdun today are green again, dotted with forests and small villages. The Meuse River flows as it always has, indifferent to the struggles that once raged along its banks. But beneath this peaceful surface, the earth still holds fragments of that terrible year. Unexploded shells that farmers occasionally uncover, remnants of trenches visible in aerial photographs, and the bones of soldiers who were never found. History lies just beneath the surface there, waiting, remembering. So settle in, allow your breathing to slow, and prepare to travel back to a winter morning in early 1916, when the world was about to change for hundreds of thousands of men who had no choice but to endure what was coming. Chapter 1: The Landscape. The region of Verdun sits in the northeastern corner of France, in what was then the département of the Meuse, named for the river that winds its way through steep-sided valleys and rolling agricultural land. Before the war came, this was countryside of considerable beauty, a landscape of forests and farms, of small villages with stone churches whose bells marked the hours of ordinary rural life. The hills rose and fell in gentle undulations, covered in beech and oak forests that turned golden in autumn and stood bare and stark in winter. Between the hills, the valleys were fertile and well-tended, producing wheat and barley and supporting herds of cattle that grazed on slopes that had known peace for generations. The city of Verdun itself was ancient, its origins reaching back to Celtic times, later becoming a Roman settlement and eventually a fortress city of considerable strategic importance. Its position on the Meuse made it a natural point of crossing and control, and over centuries it had been fortified and refortified, besieged and defended, a place where history had repeatedly chosen to make its mark. By the 19th century, Verdun was a provincial city of moderate size, with narrow streets and solid bourgeois houses, a place where garrison soldiers mixed with merchants and farmers, where life moved at the unhurried pace of a backwater that had seen enough excitement in previous centuries to be content with quiet prosperity. Surrounding the city, arranged in 2 rough rings, stood a system of fortifications that represented the height of 19th century military engineering. These forts, built in the decades following France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, were massive structures of concrete and steel, buried partially into hilltops, and designed to withstand the artillery of their era. Fort Douaumont, the largest and most formidable, sat on the highest point northeast of the city, its thick walls and deep magazines capable of housing hundreds of soldiers and dozens of heavy guns. Fort Vaux, smaller but equally modern, commanded approaches from the east. There were others too, Fort Souville, Fort Tavannes, Fort Moulinville, each positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, each connected by communication trenches and narrow-gauge railways that could move men and supplies around the defensive ring. By 1914, when the Great War began, these forts had been partially disarmed, their heavy guns removed and sent elsewhere, based on lessons learned from the fall of Belgian forts to German siege artillery. The French High Command had come to believe that permanent fortifications were obsolete in an age of massive howitzers firing shells the size of automobiles. Verdun's forts were maintained, but lightly garrisoned, their deep corridors and shell-proof chambers standing mostly empty, waiting. The land between them, the zone of fortification as it was called, remained largely as it had always been. Forested ridges with names like Bois des Cours, Bois de la Cayette, Bois du Mont, each stand of trees marking terrain that would soon acquire significance far beyond its size or strategic value. The Meuse River itself was central to everything. Flowing roughly north to south, it divided the battlefield to be into two banks, the east bank where most of the forts sat, and the west bank where two hills would achieve grim fame, Les Mortames, the Dead Man, and Côte 304. The river was not particularly wide or deep, easily bridged, but those bridges would become lifelines, choke points, targets of endless artillery fire. The river valley provided the main avenue of approach to the city from the south, and along this valley ran the main road from Bar-le-Duc, a road that would earn its own place in history before the battle was done. In the villages scattered across this landscape, people lived lives that had changed little for generations. They tended their fields, raised their families, attended Mass on Sundays, and occasionally traveled to Verdun for market day. The war, which had begun in August of 1914 with such terrible swiftness, had not yet touched them directly. The Western Front, that ragged scar of trenches and barbed wire stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, ran some distance to the west. There had been fighting in the Argonne Forest to the northwest, and the sound of distant artillery sometimes rolled across the hills like summer thunder. But Verdun itself remained behind the lines, a garrison town where wounded soldiers came to recuperate and reserves drilled in the old training grounds. As 1915 turned to 1916, winter settled over the region with particular severity. Snow fell heavily, blanketing the hills in white, filling the communication trenches that had been dug as part of the defensive system, transforming the landscape into something silent and still. The forests stood dark against the snow, their bare branches etched against gray skies. In the forts, small garrison detachments kept watch, their routines punctuated by the tedium of winter duty in remote posts where nothing much ever happened. They played cards, wrote letters home, counted the days until their rotation back to warmer billets. They did not know that they were living in the last moments of peace this land would know for nearly a year. Chapter 2. The Road to 1916. To understand why Verdun became what it became, we must step back briefly to see the larger picture of the war in its second winter. The conflict that had begun in August 1914 with such rapid, mobile campaigns had, by late autumn of that year, congealed into something no one had anticipated or prepared for. The German advance through Belgium and into France had been stopped at the Battle of the Marne in September, and in the race to the sea that followed, both sides had extended their trench lines northward until they reached the coast. By November 1914, the Western Front was complete. An unbroken line of fortifications, trenches, barbed wire, and machine gun nests running for nearly 500 miles. With no flanks to turn, no open ground for maneuver, nothing but a wall of defenders facing a wall of attackers with no clear way through. The year 1915 had been one of experimentation and disappointment for both sides. The French had launched major offensives in Artois and Champagne, throwing hundreds of thousands of men against German positions in attempts to break through that had gained little ground at enormous cost. The British, still building their army, had attacked at Neuve-Chapelle and Loos, learning the hard lessons of trench warfare. The Germans, fighting a two-front war against France and Britain in the west and Russia in the east, had largely stood on the defensive in the west while achieving spectacular victories against the Russians. By the end of 1915, the Western Front had barely moved. The trenches that had been dug in late 1914 were, in most places, still the trenches held in late 1915. Millions of shells had been fired, hundreds of thousands of men had been killed or wounded, and nothing fundamental had changed. This stalemate created a crisis of strategy for both sides. Traditional military doctrine emphasized maneuver, concentration of force, the decisive battle that would break the enemy's will and open the path to victory. But the Western Front offered no opportunity for such battles. The trenches were too strong, the defensive firepower of machine guns and artillery too devastating, the reserves too quickly available to plug any breakthrough. Attackers found themselves advancing across open ground swept by fire, cutting through belt after belt of barbed wire, only to be stopped by fresh defenders rushed to the threatened sector. The advantage lay decisively with the defense, and no one had yet found a way to overcome that fundamental mathematical reality. As winter approached in 1915, both sides faced the question of what to do in 1916. The French were committed to offensive action, believing that France, as the invaded nation, had to attack to liberate its occupied territory. The British were planning a major offensive for summer on the Somme River, where British and French sectors met. The Germans faced a more complicated calculus. Their chief of the General Staff, General Erich von Falkenhayn, understood that Germany could not win a war of attrition against the combined resources of France, Britain, and Russia. Germany's population and industrial capacity, while formidable, were smaller than those of its enemies. A long war favored the Allies. Falkenhayn therefore sought a way to knock one of Germany's enemies out of the war before the Allied advantage in resources could become decisive. Russia was already reeling from defeats in the east, but distances there were vast, and victory would require resources Germany did not have. Britain was unreachable behind the Royal Navy's blockade, its small army growing but still not a decisive factor. That left France. France was Germany's most determined enemy, the nation most committed to continuing the war, the power that held the Western Front together. If France could be defeated or forced to make peace, Britain would likely have to negotiate, and the war could be won. But how to defeat France? Falkenhayn concluded that breaking through the French lines was not necessary or even desirable. What was needed was a battle that would bleed France white, that would kill or wound so many French soldiers that France's will to continue would break. He needed a target that France would defend at any cost, a place of such symbolic or strategic importance that the French would feed division after division into the battle, a meat grinder where German artillery could methodically destroy the French army. He chose Verdun. Verdun was perfect for Falkenhayn's purposes. It was a salient, a bulge in the French lines that jutted forward into German-held territory and could be attacked from three sides. It was a fortress city, a symbol of French national pride and military prestige. Its loss would be a devastating psychological blow. Most importantly, the terrain around Verdun favored the German plan. The French had only one main road and a single-track railway connecting Verdun to the rear. If German artillery could interdict these supply lines, the French divisions in Verdun would be trapped and could be systematically destroyed. The French would have to defend Verdun, Falkenhayn reasoned, and in defending it would lose the war. Through the late autumn and early winter of 1915-16, as snow fell on the hills around Verdun and the French garrison went about its quiet routines, the Germans prepared. They did so with typical thoroughness and secrecy, moving men and guns forward at night, camouflaging positions, building ammunition dumps, constructing special rail spurs to bring forward the enormous quantities of shells the operation would require. They assembled the largest concentration of artillery ever seen, over 1,200 guns, including 13 of the massive 420mm howitzers that had destroyed the Belgian forts in 1914. They dug approach trenches, built shelters for the assault infantry, positioned medical stations and supply depots, and they waited for the weather to clear. The French, meanwhile, remained largely unaware. There were intelligence reports of German activity, reconnaissance flights that noted increased traffic, but nothing that suggested an attack of the scale being prepared. The French High Command was focused on its own offensive plans for 1916, not on defensive preparations at Verdun. The forts remained lightly garrisoned. The trenches between the forts were incomplete, lacking the depth and complexity of trench systems elsewhere on the Western Front. There were gaps, weak points, sectors where only a few hundred meters separated French and German lines. Into this situation of French unpreparations and German readiness, the month of February 1916 arrived. Chapter 3: Falkenhayn's Strategy. General Erich von Falkenhayn was not a man given to sentimentality or dramatic gestures. He was a professional soldier, a product of the Prussian military system, a careful thinker who approached war as a problem to be solved through calculation and will. He had become Chief of the General Staff in September 1914 after the failure of the Schlieffen Plan and the dismissal of his predecessor. The position placed him at the pinnacle of German military power, responsible for strategy across multiple fronts, answerable only to the Kaiser himself. It was a position of enormous responsibility during what had become a war unlike any Germany had fought before. By late 1915, Falkenhayn could see clearly the strategic situation Germany faced. The war had not gone as planned. The swift victory in the West had failed to materialize. Russia, though badly beaten in 1915, remained in the war. Britain's naval blockade was slowly strangling German imports. Italy had entered the war on the Allied side, opening yet another front. The United States, though neutral, was increasingly sympathetic to the Allies and was providing them with loans and supplies. Time was not on Germany's side. The longer the war continued, the more the Allied advantages in population, resources, and industrial capacity would tell. Falkenhayn's analysis led him to conclude that Germany needed to force a decision in 1916. He could not do this in the East, where Russia's vast spaces swallowed armies. He could not do it against Britain, which was unreachable. He had to do it against France, and he had to do it on the Western Front. But how? The trench systems were too strong for a breakthrough. Attacks elsewhere had demonstrated that conclusively. What was needed was a different approach, something that played to German strengths and French weaknesses. His solution, as he explained it in a famous memorandum to the Kaiser in December 1915, was a battle of attrition focused on a single point. He would attack at Verdun, not necessarily to break through or capture the city, but to create a battle that France could not afford to lose and could not win. The objective was not terrain, but casualties, not breakthrough, but bleed out. He wrote, with chilling clarity, about selecting a target for which the French would throw in every man they have. The formula was simple. German artillery would kill French soldiers faster than French artillery could kill German soldiers. The math would be inexorable. France would bleed white, her manpower exhausted, her will broken. Britain, left without its primary continental ally, would have to make peace. The war would be won not through brilliant maneuver, but through systematic destruction. The code name chosen for the operation was Gericht, which translates roughly as judgment or place of execution. The name was fitting in ways perhaps not fully intended. What was being planned was indeed a form of execution, a methodical process of destruction. But the judgment would fall not only on the French. The Battle of Verdun would judge the generation that had created the modern world of industry and science and nationalism, would reveal what happened when all those forces were bent toward the purpose of killing. The judgment would be rendered not in courtrooms, but in shell-cratered mud, not in legal precedents, but in casualty lists. Falkenhayn's plan had a certain terrible logic. Verdun was vulnerable. It jutted forward into German lines, creating a salient that could be attacked from three sides. The terrain was such that German artillery, positioned on the heights on both flanks, would have excellent fields of fire. The French supply situation was weak, dependent on a single road and a narrow-gauge railway. Once the battle began, Falkenhayn calculated, French pride and strategic necessity would compel them to defend Verdun regardless of cost. They would pour divisions into the battle, and German guns would destroy them. The ratio of losses would favor Germany. The French army, already bled by the offensives of 1915, would reach its breaking point. and then peace, or victory, would follow. What Falkenhayn seems not to have fully considered, or perhaps considered and dismissed, was that his plan contained a fatal flaw. If France was forced to defend Verdun at any cost, then Germany was equally committed to continuing the attack regardless of cost. The battle of attrition he planned to fight would bleed both armies. The math he relied on assumed German artillery superiority would be maintained. German supply lines would function perfectly. German morale would hold. French morale would break. It assumed a level of control over the chaos of battle that no commander in the history of warfare has ever achieved. It assumed, in short, that war would conform to calculation, that the human element could be reduced to numbers in a ledger. But all of that was still in the future as the plan took shape in the late months of 1915. For now, it was still just a concept, a memorandum, a set of orders flowing from headquarters to corps and division level. The machinery of the German army, that efficient instrument of the imperial state, began to move. Units were identified for the assault, withdrawn from other sectors, moved by rail to assembly areas behind the lines at Verdun. Artillery units were concentrated, far more guns than would normally be assigned to a single sector. Ammunition was stockpiled, the enormous quantities required for the kind of bombardment Falkenhayn envisioned. Engineers prepared the assault trenches, the jumping-off points from which the infantry would advance once the artillery had done its work. The Crown Prince of Germany, Wilhelm, nominal commander of the Fifth Army which would conduct the attack, established his headquarters at Stenne, north of Verdun. Around him gathered the staff officers who would translate Falkenhayn's strategic vision into tactical reality. They were professionals, most of them, trained in the most sophisticated military system in the world, believers in system and method and the application of overwhelming force. They studied maps, calculated artillery trajectories, planned the movement of divisions, and issued orders. They knew they were planning something unprecedented in scale, a bombardment and assault that would dwarf anything yet seen in the war. They did not know, could not know, that they were also planning their own judgment. Chapter 4: The Fortress Ring. The fortifications around Verdun were children of an earlier era, born from France's humiliation in the Franco-Prussian War and the determination that such humiliation would never be repeated. In the decades following 1871, when France had been forced to surrender Alsace and Lorraine to the new German Empire, French military engineers had designed and built a system of frontier fortifications meant to guard against future invasion. The most famous architect of these works was General Serre de Rivière, whose name became synonymous with the concrete and steel forts that ringed Verdun, Toul, Epinal, and other strategic points along France's eastern frontier. The philosophy behind these forts was straightforward. Modern warfare required strong points that could withstand siege, control key terrain and communication routes, and provide bases for counterattack. A fort was not meant to fight alone, but as part of a system, each position supporting the others with overlapping fields of fire. The forts were engineering marvels for their time, massive structures incorporating the latest military technology. They were built low and partially buried to minimize their profile, their concrete carapaces designed to resist the heaviest siege artillery then in existence. Their interior spaces were carved from living rock or protected by meters of reinforced concrete, capable of housing garrison troops, magazines of ammunition, cisterns of water, hospitals, command posts, everything needed to withstand isolation and bombardment. Fort Douaumont, completed in 1885 and substantially modernized in the years following, represented the pinnacle of this system. It sat on the highest point northeast of Verdun, dominating the approaches from that direction. Its peacetime garrison could number 400 men, and its magazines could hold thousands of shells. Its main armament, in the years before 1914, had included retractable steel turrets mounting 75mm and 155mm guns capable of engaging targets at considerable range. The fort was surrounded by barbed wire, a deep, dry moat, and fields cleared of any cover that might shelter attackers. Beneath its concrete shell lay a labyrinth of corridors, barracks rooms, storage chambers, and fighting positions connected by narrow passages lit by electric bulbs powered by the fort's own generator. It was, in its way, an underground city, a self-contained world designed to endure anything an enemy might throw at it. Fort Vaux, smaller than Douaumont but still formidable, commanded the eastern approaches. Forts Souville, Tavannes, and the others each had their assigned sectors, their fields of fire, their roles in the defensive scheme. Together they formed two rings, an outer ring of larger forts and an inner ring of smaller works closer to the city. Between the forts ran a network of infantry trenches, communication tunnels, observation posts, and strongpoints, creating a defensive zone several kilometers deep where any attacker would have to fight through layer after layer of fortification. But by 1916, this impressive system had been allowed to deteriorate. The fall of the Belgian forts at Liège and Namur in August 1914, shattered by German 420mm howitzers in a matter of days, had convinced French military thinkers that permanent fortifications were obsolete. The heavy guns had been removed from Verdun's forts and sent to where they were thought more useful, in mobile batteries supporting field operations. The garrisons had been reduced to skeleton crews, men too old or too young for frontline service, maintaining the machinery and standing watch in positions that were no longer considered critical. The infantry positions between the forts were incomplete, lacking the elaborate trench networks that had been developed elsewhere on the Western Front through 2 years of harsh experience. This weakening of Verdun's defenses was partly deliberate and partly the result of France's strategic focus elsewhere. The French High Command, under General Joffre, was planning major offensives for 1916 in coordination with the British attack on the Somme and a Russian offensive in the east. The thinking was offensive, not defensive. Resources of men and material were concentrated where France intended to attack, not in quiet sectors like Verdun where nothing much was expected to happen. It was a reasonable calculation based on what was known at the time, but it left Verdun vulnerable in ways that would soon become tragically apparent. Fort Douaumont, which should have been a linchpin of the defense, held a garrison of fewer than 60 men in February 1916, mostly territorials and gunners serving the single turret that remained operational. The fort's vast underground spaces echoed with emptiness. Its magazines held ammunition for guns that were no longer there. Its barracks could house hundreds but held dozens. Similar situations existed at the other forts, strong in concrete but weak in men and weapons. The trenches between the forts were in even worse condition, many of them filled with snow and ice that winter. Their garrisons stretched thin, their wire old and in need of repair. Into this situation of French weakness, the German preparations proceeded through January and into February. Observation from the air and from German artillery spotters on the heights revealed the gaps in the French defenses, the incomplete trenches, the absence of deep reserve positions. The German artillery, as it was positioned and registered on its targets, noted the coordinates of every fort, every trench line, every crossroad, every suspected command post. The massive howitzers, those 420mm monsters that had proved capable of demolishing the Belgian forts, were carefully sighted where they could drop their enormous shells onto the forts of Verdun. Everything was prepared, rehearsed, calculated. All that remained was to wait for weather suitable for the attack. Chapter 5. February 21st, the bombardment begins. The morning of February 21st, 1916, dawned cold and gray over the hills of Verdun. Mist hung in the valleys, thick and white, obscuring visibility and muffling sound. In the French trenches, the dawn stand-to passed quietly, soldiers stamping their feet and blowing on their hands to ward off the cold, watching the fog-shrouded no-man's land for movement that did not come. The routine of trench life continued. Breakfast of weak coffee and bread, small tasks of maintenance and sanitation, the endless waiting that characterized life at the front. Some men wrote letters, others slept wrapped in their coats, and a few kept watch through periscopes that showed nothing but gray mist dissolving into gray sky. Behind the German lines, the storm was gathering. The bombardment had been scheduled to begin at 7:15 that morning, but the fog delayed it. Hour after hour passed while German commanders waited for visibility to improve, knowing that their artillery spotters needed to see their targets to direct fire effectively. The infantry, crouched in their assault trenches, waited with growing tension, the anticipation building with each passing hour. The gunners stood by their pieces, shells stacked ready, lanyards in hand. And still the fog persisted, holding the battlefield in suspension, the last moments of peace stretching on while hundreds of thousands of men on both sides waited for something to begin. At 7:15 in the morning, the scheduled start time came and went without fire. 8 o'clock passed, then 9, then 10. The German chief of staff grew impatient, but still the orders were held. Visibility had to improve. The bombardment depended on observed fire, on corrections called in by spotters watching the fall of shells, on methodical destruction of known targets. To fire blind into the fog would waste ammunition and warn French. And so the waiting continued, tense and prolonged, until finally, shortly after noon, the mist began to lift, torn by winds from the north, revealing patches of the French positions, trenches etched in snow, the dark masses of the forts on their hilltops. At exactly 12:07 in the afternoon, with a sound that witnesses would later struggle to describe, the bombardment began. More than 1,200 German guns opened fire simultaneously, their muzzle flashes rippling along the heights east and north of Verdun like lightning in a storm cloud. The shells arced across the gray February sky and fell upon the French positions with devastating effect. High explosive shells designed to blast trenches and dugouts apart. Shrapnel shells that burst overhead, showering fragments onto anyone caught in the open. Gas shells releasing their choking clouds. And the massive projectiles from the 420mm howitzers, each shell weighing nearly a ton, dropping from high trajectory to bury themselves deep before exploding with enough force to collapse underground shelters and shake the earth for kilometers around. The noise was unlike anything yet heard in the war. Individual explosions merged into a continuous roar, a physical presence that pressed on the ears and chest, that made the ground shake and the air vibrate. Men caught in the bombardment described it as hell made audible, as the end of the world, as something beyond their vocabulary to express. The French positions disappeared beneath fountains of earth and smoke. Whole sections of trench line obliterated in seconds. Dugouts collapsed, communication wires cut, men buried alive or torn apart, or driven mad by the concussion. The shells fell without pause, without mercy, in patterns that had been calculated to methodically work over every meter of the defensive zone. This was not simply fire for effect, not the random shelling that had characterized so much of the war's artillery duels. This was systematic destruction, carried out with Prussian thoroughness. Each battery had its assigned target, its schedule of fire. The German gunners worked with mechanical precision, loading and firing, while the ammunition trains brought forward endless supplies of shells from the huge dumps that had been prepared. The spotters called corrections, adjusting fall of shot, walking the fire up and down trench lines, concentrating on strong points and suspected command posts. Nothing was random. Everything was according to plan. For 9 hours, the bombardment continued without significant pause. 9 hours during which the French frontline positions were subjected to a concentration of fire unprecedented in warfare up to that time. Estimates of shells fired that day range from 1 million to 2 million, an almost incomprehensible weight of explosive hurled onto a front of about 15 kilometers. The French soldiers who survived did so by pressing themselves into the deepest dugouts, into shell holes, into any depression in the ground that might offer protection. They could not fight back. Their own artillery was outranged and outnumbered. They could not retreat. Orders were to hold position. They could only endure, hour after hour, as their world was torn apart above and around them. As darkness fell on that first day, the intensity of the fire finally began to slacken, though it did not stop entirely. The German gunners, exhausted from 9 hours of continuous work, reduced their rate of fire to allow barrels to cool and crews to rest. In the French lines, in what remained of the French lines, survivors emerged from their shelters into a landscape transformed. Trenches had been obliterated, turned into chains of overlapping craters. The ground was torn and churned, littered with debris and bodies. Communication had been lost with most forward positions. The chain of command was disrupted.
And in the gathering darkness, with snow beginning to fall again, the survivors could hear a new sound, the movement of German infantry beginning their advance. Chapter 6: The First Days. The German infantry who advanced in the early evening of February 21st moved cautiously, probing the French positions, testing what the bombardment had achieved. They were veterans, specially selected assault troops trained in new tactics of fire and movement.
They carried light equipment, grenades, flamethrowers, the tools of trench warfare. Behind them came engineers with explosives to clear obstacles, and following them, the main assault divisions ready to exploit any breakthrough. What they found was devastation. The French front line had largely ceased to exist as an organized position. Trenches were filled with debris, wire was torn apart, strongpoints were ruins. But they also found survivors, French soldiers who emerged from dugouts and shell holes to fight, often with desperate courage. The fighting in those first hours was confused, brutal, small unit actions in darkness and snow. Germans trying to consolidate gains, French trying to establish new defensive lines from the ruins of the old. The Bois de Cour, the Cours Wood, became the scene of the first sustained resistance. Here, the 56th and 59th Chasseurs Battalions, elite light infantry, held positions under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Émile Drian, a soldier of the old school, a veteran, a man who had warned his superiors that Verdun's defenses were inadequate and had been ignored. Drian's men fought with the desperation of those who know they are doomed but choose to sell their lives dearly. They held their shattered positions for 3 days, fighting from shell hole to shell hole, launching small counterattacks, refusing to break even as German forces surrounded them. Colonel Driant himself died on February 22nd, shot through the head while leading a counterattack, his body left in the shattered woods where he fell. His battalions were destroyed, overwhelmed finally by sheer numbers and continued bombardment. But they had bought time, precious hours during which French reinforcements could be rushed forward and new defensive lines could be organized. The sacrifice of the chasseurs in the Bois de Cour, the Cours Wood, became one of the first legends of Verdun, an example of courage that would be repeated 10,000 times in the months to come. By February 24th, 3 days into the battle, the German advance had gained several kilometers, overwhelming the French forward positions and reaching the intermediate defense line. Villages were taken, Haumont fell, then Brabant-sur-Meuse. The French XX Corps, which held this sector, was being ground down, its regiments shattered, its command structure in chaos. Units that had started the battle at full strength were reduced to fragments. Whole battalions simply disappeared, annihilated by the bombardment or overrun in the assault. The German plan seemed to be working. French casualties were enormous, far exceeding German losses. The bleed-white strategy was producing results. But the French did not break. Reinforcements were arriving, rushed forward along the single road from Bar-le-Duc, the lifeline that was already acquiring its famous name, La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Road. Divisions were pulled from quiet sectors elsewhere on the Western Front and sent to Verdun, their men packed into trucks that rolled day and night along that single narrow road. The French High Command, whatever its failures in preparing Verdun's defenses, was now committed to holding. General Joffre, the overall French commander, ordered that Verdun must not fall. General de Castelnau, Joffre's deputy, visited the sector personally and issued orders for a defense to the death. And on February 25th, a new commander arrived to take charge of the defense, a general who would become forever associated with Verdun, whose words would echo through French history, Philippe Pétain. Chapter 7: The Sacred Road. La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Road, was in its origin nothing more than a secondary road, a departmental route numbered RD 1916, connecting the town of Bar-le-Duc to Verdun through a series of small villages and rolling countryside. It was narrow, unpaved in sections, never designed for the traffic it was about to receive. But by chance and geography, it was also the only viable supply route into Verdun once the battle began. The main railway line from Paris had been cut by German artillery. The narrow-gauge railway that served the fortress ring had limited capacity. That left the road from Bar-le-Duc, and upon that single thread would depend the entire French defense.
The transformation of this ordinary road into the sacred way began within days of the battle's start. Maurice Barré, a writer and nationalist politician, gave it the name that would stick, recognizing that this road had become something more than a transportation route. It had become a symbol of France's determination to endure. Along its length, an endless stream of trucks carried men and supplies forward and evacuated wounded back. The traffic was organized with careful precision, the road divided into lanes, speed limits enforced, repair crews stationed every few kilometers to fill shell holes and fix drainage, police directing traffic at intersections, trucks moving in a constant flow, day and night, regardless of weather or German artillery fire.
The statistics of the Sacred Road tell their own story of logistical achievement under the most difficult circumstances. At its peak, some 6,000 trucks traveled the road each day, one truck passing every 14 seconds, day and night, through winter mud and spring rain and summer heat. Each truck carried 5 to 6 tons of supplies, or 20 to 30 men. Over the course of the battle, more than 3/4 of the French army would pass along this road at some point, rotated through the inferno of Verdun on a system that Pétain would organize, the Noria, named after the water wheels of North Africa that lifted water in an endless cycle. The men who drove these trucks became anonymous heroes of Verdun, their names mostly forgotten, but their contribution essential. They drove without headlights at night to avoid German artillery, navigating by memory and touch along roads they came to know intimately. They drove through bombardments when German guns managed to range on the road, through mechanical breakdowns, through exhaustion. The road itself required constant maintenance, a never-ending battle against the destruction caused by heavy traffic and enemy fire. Territorial units, men too old for frontline service, worked in shifts to fill holes, lay gravel, repair drainage ditches, clear wreckage. A narrow-gauge railway was built parallel to the road to carry stone for repairs, and quarries along the route worked continuously to supply the material needed to keep the surface passable. For the soldiers traveling to Verdun for the first time, the journey along the Sacred Road was often their introduction to what awaited them. The trucks rolled north through country that grew progressively more damaged, past villages that showed signs of bombardment, past hospitals filled with wounded, past cemeteries growing daily larger. The sound of the guns grew louder with each kilometer, a deep, continuous rumble that made the air vibrate. And at night, the horizon ahead glowed with the flashes of explosions, thousands of them, a continuous flickering light show that marked where the battle raged. Men sat in the trucks, mostly silent, smoking, trying not to think too much about what was coming, trying to maintain the fatalism that was the soldiers' only real defense against fear. The road represented more than logistics and supply. It became a symbol of connection, a physical link between the men at Verdun and the nation behind them, a reminder that they were not forgotten, that France was committed to their struggle. Soldiers wrote home about the endless convoys, about the determination they represented. Pétain himself understood the symbolic importance of the road and ensured it was maintained and protected at any cost. German artillery tried repeatedly to cut it, but French counter-battery fire and constant repairs kept it functioning. The road had become sacred not only in name, but in the minds of those who depended on it for survival. Chapter 8, They Shall Not Pass. General Philippe Pétain arrived at Verdun on February 25, 1916, to take command of a desperate situation. He was 59 years old, a soldier of long experience, but relatively junior rank for a man of his age, having spent most of his career as an instructor at the École de Guerre, teaching defensive tactics at a time when French military doctrine emphasized offensive spirit above all. His cautious, defensive-minded approach had kept him from higher command, but it was precisely this approach that was needed now. Pétain was a realist, a man who understood the power of modern firepower and the value of soldiers' lives, qualities that would make him, for a time, the most respected commander in the French army. His first acts upon assuming command revealed his character and his method. He toured the front lines personally, observing conditions, talking to officers and men, assessing what was needed. What he found was chaos. Units intermixed and disorganized, communication systems disrupted, supply arrangements inadequate, command structure confused. The French defense was improvised, reactive, close to breaking. Pétain set about imposing order with systematic thoroughness. He reorganized the command structure, established clear lines of authority, improved communications by laying new telephone lines and establishing redundant systems. He ensured that artillery was properly coordinated, that infantry received the support they needed, that reserves were positioned where they could respond quickly to crises. But Pétain's most important innovation was the noria, the rotation system that would define the French response to Verdun. Rather than leaving divisions in the line until they were destroyed, as had been done in earlier battles, Pétain instituted a regular rotation. Divisions would be sent to Verdun for a period of days or weeks, then pulled back to rest and refit before being sent elsewhere. This meant that the burden of Verdun would be spread across the entire French army rather than falling on a few unfortunate units. It meant that divisions would not be ground down to nothing but would be pulled out before they broke. It meant that most French soldiers would experience Verdun, would share in its ordeal, would feel part of the collective effort to hold. The noria had several effects. Militarily, it maintained the fighting capacity of units by preventing their complete exhaustion. Psychologically, it gave men hope, the knowledge that their time in hell would be limited, that they would be relieved. Nationally, it spread the experience of Verdun across France, making it a shared ordeal rather than the fate of a few divisions. By the end of the battle, some 70% of the French army had served at Verdun. It became France's battle, the place where the nation proved its resolve, where ordinary French soldiers demonstrated that they could endure anything. Pétain's words, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass, became the motto of the defense, a declaration of determination that resonated through the French army and the French nation. Pétain also understood the importance of artillery in modern warfare. He organized the French guns into a coordinated system, established observation posts with good communications to battery positions, created dedicated counter-battery groups tasked with suppressing German artillery. He increased the ammunition supply, ensuring that French guns could match German fire. He understood that infantry could not hold ground that was being destroyed by bombardment, that the real battle was between the rival artilleries, and that French gunners had to win that duel or the defense would fail. Under his direction, French artillery performance improved dramatically. German batteries began to suffer losses, and the German superiority in firepower began to erode. But perhaps most importantly, Pétain cared for his soldiers in ways that the French High Command often did not. He ensured that hot food reached the front lines, that rest areas behind the lines were properly organized, that wounded men were evacuated efficiently, that leaves were granted fairly. He visited units regularly, talked to common soldiers, listened to their complaints, acted on what he heard. He became known as a commander who understood what his men endured, who would not waste their lives needlessly, who saw them as human beings rather than mere instruments of strategy. This care earned him loyalty and trust that went beyond simple military discipline. Soldiers at Verdun knew that Pétain would not ask them to do the impossible, and that knowledge made them willing to do what seemed impossible. Under Pétain's leadership, the French defense stabilized. The German advance, which had seemed irresistible in the first days, began to slow. French resistance stiffened. The systematic defense that Pétain organized proved capable of absorbing German attacks, bleeding them, stopping them. By early March, the battle had settled into a grim equilibrium, both sides locked in a struggle that neither could win quickly, but neither could afford to abandon. Chapter 9. Fort Douaumont falls. On February 25th, the same day Pétain arrived to take command, Fort Douaumont fell to the Germans in circumstances that seemed almost unbelievable. This massive fortress, the strongest point in Verdun's defenses, the place that should have required weeks of siege to capture, was taken by a small German unit without a prolonged fight. The story of how this happened reveals much about the confusion of those first days and the consequences of French unpreparedness. The fort's garrison on February 25th numbered fewer than 60 men, mostly territorials and artillerymen serving the single remaining gun turret.
The fort had been heavily bombarded for several days, its exterior pounded by high explosive shells, including hits from the massive 420mm howitzers. The bombardment had damaged some external works and cut telephone communications, but the fort's structure remained intact, its deep chambers still providing protection, its guns still capable of firing. But the garrison was small, isolated, uncertain of what was happening outside, and without clear orders. A German unit, part of the 24th Brandenburg Regiment, advancing past the fort in fog and snow, discovered that its superstructure appeared abandoned. A small group of men, led by a sergeant, entered the fort through an embrasure, penetrated its corridors, and found the garrison confused and largely unresisting. By nightfall, the Germans controlled Fort Douaumont, the greatest fortress in the Verdun system, at the cost of a handful of casualties. The Brandenburg men who captured it could hardly believe their luck. The French command could hardly believe their loss.
The fall of Douaumont was a psychological catastrophe for France. News of the fortress's capture spread through the French army and the nation, creating shock and dismay. How could the greatest fort fall so easily? What did this mean for Verdun's defense? German propaganda made the most of the achievement, announcing the capture as proof of German superiority and French weakness. Church bells rang in German cities. The Kaiser himself sent congratulations. The capture of Douaumont seemed to validate Falkenhayn's strategy, suggesting that Verdun would indeed fall and France would bleed itself white trying to prevent it. But the fortress's loss, shocking as it was, did not doom the defense. Pétain organized a new defensive line behind Douaumont, using Fort Souville and the intermediate positions. He refused to authorize immediate counterattacks to recapture the lost fort, recognizing that such attacks would be costly and likely to fail. The recapture of Douaumont, he determined, would come later, when conditions were favorable, when the French had regained the initiative. For now, it was enough to hold, to stabilize the line, to prevent further German advance. The Germans, for their part, found that occupying Douaumont brought problems as well as prestige. The fort became a target for French artillery, which pounded it ceaselessly. Its deep chambers, which should have provided safety, became traps when French shells buried entrances and damaged ventilation. The Germans packed the fort with troops, using it as a barracks and command post, but the constant bombardment made it a miserable posting, dark and airless and dangerous. Men assigned there spoke of it with dread, of the claustrophobia of the deep corridors, the stench of inadequate sanitation, the fear of being buried alive if French shells collapsed a section. The fort that was supposed to represent German triumph became another place of suffering in a landscape of suffering. The French determination to recapture Douaumont became one of the defining characteristics of the Verdun battle. The fort acquired symbolic importance far beyond its military value. It represented French honor, French determination, French refusal to accept defeat. For months, French soldiers would attack toward Douaumont, trying to take back what had been lost. These attacks would cost thousands of lives and gain little ground, but they demonstrated the French will to resist, the refusal to accept the German occupation of French soil.
Douaumont became a rallying cry, a symbol, a test of wills between two nations locked in a death struggle. Chapter 10. March, the assault continues. As February gave way to March, the battle spread to the west bank of the Meuse. General von Falkenhayn's original plan had focused on the east bank, but the stubborn French resistance there and the effectiveness of French artillery firing from positions on the west bank convinced German commanders that those guns had to be silenced. On March 6th, German forces launched a major assault on the west bank, targeting two hills that dominated the surrounding terrain: Le Mort-Homme, the Dead Man, and Côte 304, Hill 304. The origin of the name Mort-Homme is lost to history, some forgotten incident or person that gave the hill its ominous title. But in March 1916, the name acquired new and terrible significance. The hill was not particularly high, rising only to about 295 meters, but its position gave observation over a wide area and made it a key artillery position. French batteries positioned on and around Mort-Homme could fire on German troops advancing on the east bank, providing enfilade fire that made attacks there more difficult. To continue the offensive on the east bank, the Germans needed to capture Mortholm and silence those guns. The assault on Mortholm began with the now familiar massive bombardment, shells falling in such density that the hilltop was obscured by smoke and dust. German infantry advanced in waves, fighting their way through French positions in attacks that were methodical and determined. The French defense was equally determined, counterattacking to recover lost trenches, holding every position as long as possible, making the Germans pay for every meter. The fighting surged back and forth across the scarred slopes, neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage, both sides taking terrible casualties. By mid-March, the Germans had taken the lower slopes of Mortholm, but the crest remained in French hands. The hill had become a salient, a bulge in the French line subject to fire from three sides, but still the French held on. Orders from Pétain were clear: yield ground slowly if necessary, but do not break, do not allow a breakthrough.
The French soldiers on Mortholm followed these orders with grim determination, knowing that every day they held was a day the German offensive was stalled, a day French reinforcements could arrive, a day closer to ultimate survival. Côte 304, a short distance northwest of Mortholm, came under similar assault. The hill, rising to 304 meters, was fought over with the same intensity, the same back-and-forth struggles, the same appalling casualties. The two hills became paired in soldiers' minds, twin places of horror where death waited on every slope, where the mud mixed with blood and bone, where the shell fire never stopped, and survival was a matter of luck more than skill. March turned to April, and still the fighting ground on. The German advance measured its gains in hundreds of meters, sometimes in mere dozens of meters. Villages changed hands. Malancourt fell, then Housecourt, tiny places that became household names in France as newspapers reported the fighting. But the French line held. The defense absorbed each assault, bent but did not break, counterattacked to recover critical ground, held on. The Noria continued, divisions rotating through Verdun, sharing the ordeal, spreading the burden. The weather added to everyone's misery. March in northeastern France is often cold and wet, and 1916 was no exception. Rain turned the battlefield into a swamp. Trenches became rivers of mud. Shell holes filled with water. Men lived in conditions that seemed designed to break the human spirit. Cold, wet, filthy, exhausted, under constant fire, surrounded by death. They developed the Verdun stare, a 1,000-yard look of men pushed beyond normal endurance. They aged years in weeks, and still they held. The artillery dominated everything. Both sides fired millions of shells, the bombardments continuous, the noise unending. The landscape was transformed beyond recognition, every natural feature obliterated, replaced by a moonscape of craters and shattered trees. No grass grew, no birds sang, nothing lived except the men condemned to fight there. The earth itself seemed to have died, killed by the explosives poured upon it in quantities that would have seemed impossible before the war. Chapter 11. April, Spring of Despair. April brought no respite. If anything, the fighting intensified as better weather allowed both sides to increase their operations. The Germans remained committed to their offensive, still believing that one more push, one more assault, would break the French. The French remained committed to defense, determined to hold regardless of cost. The result was stalemate at a level of violence unprecedented in warfare. On the west bank, the struggle for Mortholm continued without resolution. The Germans held most of the hill, but could not take the crest. French artillery, positioned in depth behind the hill, continued to fire effectively despite German counter-battery efforts. The cost to both sides was enormous. German regiments that attacked at full strength were reduced to fragments in days. French divisions, rotated through the sector for their turn in the line, emerged decimated, their ranks thinned by casualties that sometimes exceeded 50%. The fighting took on a character all its own, different from battles elsewhere on the Western Front. Verdun became less about tactics and strategy than about simple endurance, about which side could absorb more punishment, which army could withstand more casualties, which nation could endure more grief. Falkenhayn's strategy of attrition was being tested, but the attrition was proving mutual.
German casualties, though still lower than French, were mounting to levels that Germany could not sustain indefinitely. The bleed white strategy was bleeding both armies. On the east bank, the Germans made renewed efforts to advance past Fort Douaumont toward Fort Souville and the city beyond. These attacks made limited gains at high cost. The French defense had deepened, learning from experience, adapting to German tactics. French artillery had improved its coordination, its response times, its accuracy. The artillery duel, the fundamental contest underlying all the infantry fighting, was becoming more balanced as French gunners gained experience and French industry produced more shells. The soldiers on both sides developed a culture of endurance, a dark pride in survival. Veterans of Verdun, those who survived multiple rotations through the battle, gained status in their units. They taught newcomers how to survive, where to shelter, how to read the sounds of incoming shells, when to advance and when to take cover. The thousand small lessons that might mean the difference between life and death. They also developed a fatalism, an acceptance that death was random and inevitable, that courage and cowardice mattered less than chance, that survival was ultimately a matter of luck. The French soldiers' experience at Verdun was shaped by the Noria system.
A division would receive orders to move to Verdun, would travel by train to Bar-le-Duc, would be loaded into trucks for the journey up the Sacred Road. The sound of the guns would grow louder. The evidence of battle would become visible: wrecked vehicles, hastily buried bodies, shell holes, damaged buildings. Finally, the division would detruck and march forward, entering the battle zone, relieving exhausted units, taking over positions that were often little more than chains of shell holes connected by shallow scrapes in the mud. Time in the line varied, but typically lasted between 1 and 2 weeks. During that time, soldiers lived in conditions of indescribable misery. They were under artillery fire constantly, day and night, shells ranging from small caliber to the massive projectiles from the German heavy howitzers. They could not light fires for warmth or cooking because smoke drew fire. They could not move by day because observation was too good. They lived on cold food, slept in mud, performed natural functions in whatever corner of their hole they could spare. Water was scarce, often contaminated. Rations were irregular, dependent on carrying parties that had to traverse fire-swept ground. Medical evacuation was difficult and dangerous. Casualties accumulated steadily. Artillery caused most losses, men simply blown apart by direct hits or buried by near misses or wounded by fragments. Machine gun fire added to the toll during any movement. Gas attacks, though less common at Verdun than on some sectors, caused particular horror and lingering death. The wounded faced an uncertain fate, dependent on whether they could be reached by stretcher bearers and evacuated before they bled out or died of shock. Many wounded simply disappeared, blown to pieces by subsequent shells, their bodies unrecoverable, their names eventually listed as missing. But after that week or two in hell, relief came. The division would be pulled back, would march or ride trucks south on the Sacred Road, would reach rest areas where there was hot food and relative quiet, and the chance to sleep without fear of sudden death. Men could wash, change clothes, write letters, try to process what they had experienced. Then, after some time, they would move to another sector of the front, away from Verdun, and another division would take their place in the rotation. This system spread the burden, but also spread the trauma, making Verdun's experience common to the French army as a whole. Chapter 12, May, the height of fury. May brought what many participants later recalled as the most intense period of the entire battle. The fighting reached a crescendo as both sides, exhausted but still determined, launched major efforts. For the Germans, the capture of Fort Vaux became the objective, a necessary step toward breaking through to Verdun itself. For the French, holding Vaux was essential, a test of whether their defense could withstand the maximum pressure Germany could apply. Fort Vaux was smaller than Douaumont, but more modern in some respects, with better designed defensive features and a more compact layout. Its garrison, learning from Douaumont's loss, was more substantial, several hundred men determined not to allow another fortress to fall through inadequate defense.
The fort's commander, Major Sylvain Eugène Raynal, was a career officer, methodical and determined, the type of man who would follow orders and hold his position to the last extremity. The German assault on Fort Vaux began with a bombardment of extreme intensity. For days, shells of all calibers hammered the fort, seeking to destroy its external works and seal its entrances. Flamethrower teams moved forward to burn out the defensive positions around the fort's perimeter. Infantry fought their way into the superstructure, capturing the outer works, pushing toward the fort's main galleries. The fighting moved into the fort's corridors, a claustrophobic nightmare of grenade exchanges and close-quarter combat in darkness lit only by muzzle flashes. Major Raynal organized the defense with skill, using the fort's internal layout to advantage, establishing barriers at key junctions, falling back methodically from position to position deeper into the fort's structure. But the garrison faced a problem that artillery could not solve and courage could not overcome. They were running out of water. The fort's cisterns had been damaged or contaminated. What water remained had to be rationed ever more strictly. Men weakened from thirst and the heat generated by so many bodies in confined spaces. The wounded suffered terribly without water to drink or clean their injuries. On June 2nd, Major Raynal sent his last message by carrier pigeon, a bird that flew through German fire to reach French lines with a message tube attached to its leg.
The message reported the garrison's desperate situation, out of water, running low on ammunition, under constant assault, but still holding. The pigeon's flight became one of Verdun's famous stories, a symbol of determination and communication under the most adverse circumstances. But no relief could reach the fort. On June 7th, after 6 days of siege, with his men unable to continue for lack of water, Major Raynal surrendered Fort Vaux to the Germans. The loss of Vaux was another psychological blow to France, though less shocking than Douaumont's fall, since Vaux's garrison had fought magnificently and surrendered only when continued resistance became physically impossible. Major Raynal and his men were treated with respect by their German captors, who recognized their courage. But the fort's loss meant the Germans were now only a few kilometers from Verdun itself, closer than they had been since the battle began. The crisis of the defense had arrived. Chapter 13. June, the Crisis. June 1916 brought Verdun's defenders to the edge of collapse. The Germans, having captured Fort Vaux, pressed forward with what they intended to be their final effort. The objective was Fort Souville, the last major fortress protecting Verdun from the northeast. If Souville fell, the path to the city would be open. The German assault, launched on June 23rd, was preceded by bombardment with a new horror, phosgene gas shells mixed with high explosive, creating a toxic cloud that overcame French defenders and enabled German infantry to advance further than at any point since February. German soldiers reached the superstructure of Fort Souville, fought their way to within meters of its entrance, stood on ground from which they could see the spires of Verdun's cathedral in the distance. It was the high water mark of the German offensive, the closest they would come to their objective. But they could not take that final step. French resistance, though strained to the breaking point, did not break. Counterattacks, launched with desperate urgency, pushed the Germans back from Souville's gates. French artillery, firing at maximum intensity, broke up German reinforcements trying to exploit the advance. By June 24th, the crisis had passed. The Germans were stopped. Multiple factors contributed to the German failure to break through. French reserves, though depleted, were still available and were committed at the critical moment. French artillery, under the coordination that Pétain had established, delivered effective fire that disrupted German attack formations. But perhaps most importantly, German soldiers themselves were approaching exhaustion. They had been attacking since February, taking casualties in every assault, living under conditions as terrible as those endured by the French. Their infantry regiments were worn down, their morale strained, their offensive power diminished. And on July 1, 1916, the British Fourth Army attacked on the Somme River, launching the offensive that had been planned for months. The Somme offensive, which would become its own byword for costly stalemate and attritional horror, nevertheless achieved one immediate objective. It relieved pressure on Verdun. The German High Command had to divert divisions from Verdun to meet the British threat.
Resources of men and ammunition that would have gone to continuing the Verdun offensive were redirected north. The maximum pressure on Verdun was past. The battle would continue, but it would continue as stalemate, no longer as German offensive and French defensive crisis. Chapter 14, The Somme Offensive. The Battle of the Somme, which began on July 1st with the bloodiest single day in British military history, was intended partly to relieve pressure on Verdun, and in this at least it succeeded immediately. German divisions were withdrawn from Verdun and sent to the Somme. German artillery batteries were redeployed. German resources were divided between two major battles instead of concentrated on one. For the exhausted defenders of Verdun, this meant a reduction in the intensity of German attacks, a breathing space in which to recover and rebuild. General Pétain, understanding that the crisis had passed and that French forces at Verdun could now think in terms beyond mere survival, began to plan for eventual counteroffensives to recover lost ground. But such operations would require time to prepare, reserves to accumulate, and, most importantly, a complete restoration of French artillery superiority. For now, the summer months would be a period of relative stalemate, with both sides holding their positions, conducting limited attacks and counterattacks, but no longer engaged in the massive offensives that had characterized the battle's first months. The soldiers in the line experienced this shift in the battle's character with relief mixed with continued suffering. The artillery fire never stopped entirely. Men continued to die every day. Conditions remained appalling.
But the intensity decreased, the sense of immediate crisis passed, and survival began to seem possible again rather than merely a matter of chance. Units could be relieved on more regular schedules, supply lines functioned more smoothly. Rest areas behind the lines expanded and improved. Life at Verdun remained hell, but perhaps a slightly more endurable hell than before. For the French nation, the Somme offensive also provided psychological relief. The British were now fully engaged, sharing the burden of fighting Germany, demonstrating the Allied commitment to common victory. The sense that France faced Germany alone, that Verdun tested French will in isolation, gave way to a sense of shared effort and mutual support. The newspapers that had reported every detail of Verdun's struggle now divided their coverage between Verdun and the Somme, showing French readers that the war was larger than one battle, that ultimate victory depended on efforts across the entire front. Chapter 15, Summer Stalemate. Through July, August, and September, the Battle of Verdun continued in a lower key, no longer the center of the world's attention, no longer the place where the war's outcome would be decided, but still a place of suffering and death, still a sector where French and German soldiers faced each other across shell-torn ground and killed each other with artillery and rifle and machine gun. The fighting took on a routine character, as much as anything at Verdun could be called routine. Daily artillery exchanges, small-scale raids and counter-raids, constant sniper fire, occasional larger attacks that gained or lost a few hundred meters of territory. The soldiers adapted to this new phase with the flexibility of men who had no choice but to adapt. They learned the rhythms of their sector, which areas were particularly dangerous, when German artillery typically fired its scheduled concentrations, where relatively safe routes existed between positions. They developed the skills of trench warfare to a high degree, how to move silently at night, how to construct effective shelters from minimal materials, how to cook food without creating smoke, how to maintain weapons in the perpetual mud, how to sleep despite noise and fear. These skills, purchased at terrible cost over months of experience, were passed from veterans to replacements, a continuous process of education in survival. The landscape of Verdun in summer presented a scene of utter desolation. What had once been forest and field was now bare earth, churned into mud and dust, cratered with shells, littered with debris of every kind, shattered weapons, unexploded shells, fragments of equipment, and everywhere, inadequately buried bodies emerging from collapsed trenches or shallow graves. The smell was overpowering, a miasma of corruption and chemicals and human waste that clung to everything and everyone. Water was contaminated, food tasted of decay, and men's clothes carried the stench until they were finally able to bathe and change when pulled from the line. Disease was common, spread by lice and contaminated water, and the impossibility of maintaining sanitation in active battle zones.
Dysentery was endemic, weakening men already exhausted by combat and poor rations. Trench foot afflicted those who could not keep their feet dry. Rats, grown huge on abundant food, were everywhere, a plague that spread disease and destroyed supplies and tormented men trying to rest. The traditional enemies of armies, disease, exposure, privation, killed and weakened almost as many men as combat itself. Yet amid this horror, soldiers maintained their humanity through small acts of routine and connection. They formed bonds of comradeship that became the primary motivation for endurance. Fighting not for abstract concepts of nation or honor, but for the men in their immediate unit, the few square meters of trench that was their world, the determination not to let their comrades down. They shared food and tobacco, told stories, made dark jokes about their situation, maintained the rituals of military life that gave structure to existence. When they were pulled from the line, they drank and sang and visited brothels and tried to forget what they had experienced and what they would soon experience again. Letters home became lifelines to a world that seemed increasingly distant and unreal. Soldiers wrote to wives and mothers and sweethearts, describing their experiences in terms heavily censored both by military authorities and by their own desire not to frighten loved ones. They wrote of boredom and discomfort rather than terror and death, of small incidents rather than major battles, of hope for leave and peace rather than doubt about survival. The letters they received in return, carried up the sacred road and distributed in the trenches, were treasured possessions, physical links to home and normalcy and a future that might exist if they survived. Chapter 16, Nivelle Takes Command.
In May 1916, General Robert Nivelle had taken command of the Second Army from Pétain, who was promoted to command Army Group Center. Nivelle was a different type of commander from Pétain, more aggressive, more confident in offensive action, less cautious about casualties. He had made his reputation in successful limited counterattacks earlier in the battle and believed that properly prepared offensives using overwhelming artillery fire could break German positions and recover lost ground. His philosophy was summed up in the phrase that became his trademark: "We have the formula." By autumn, with German offensive power spent and French resources rebuilt, Nivelle prepared to put his formula into practice. The objective was to recapture the ground lost since February, particularly the symbolically important Forts Douaumont and Vaux. Such a victory would restore French prestige, demonstrate that the German offensive had ultimately failed, and provide a positive note on which to end the year. Nivelle assembled substantial forces, concentrated massive artillery, planned his attack with meticulous attention to preparation and timing. The preparations took months. Artillery positions were improved and ammunition stockpiled. Infantry rehearsed their attacks over ground laid out to simulate the objectives. Intelligence gathered details about German positions and defenses. Counter-battery work sought to identify and target German guns. The plan called for a massive preliminary bombardment, followed by infantry assault in carefully controlled phases, each phase having limited objectives that would be consolidated before advancing further. It was methodical warfare on the largest scale, applying industrial organization to the problem of breaking German defenses. German forces at Verdun, meanwhile, had transitioned to the defensive. They held strong positions on ground they had taken at such cost and had no intention of giving it up easily. They had fortified the captured French forts, organized defense in depth, positioned artillery to support counterattacks. They expected French attempts to recover lost ground and were prepared to make such attempts costly. Both sides understood that the autumn fighting would determine Verdun's final balance sheet, whether the battle would end as German victory, French recovery, or mutual exhaustion. Chapter 17, October, Reclaiming the Forts. On October 24, 1916, after 3 days of intensive bombardment, French forces attacked on the east bank of the Meuse, with the recapture of Forts Douaumont as their primary objective. The assault was a model of careful preparation and execution. French 75mm field guns and heavy artillery had pounded German positions until they were little more than shell-cratered ruins. German counter-battery fire had been suppressed by French guns that had located and targeted German batteries. When the French infantry advanced, they did so behind a creeping barrage, a curtain of exploding shells that moved forward at a walking pace, with the infantry following just behind. The attack achieved surprise despite the obvious preparations. German defenders, expecting an assault but uncertain of its timing, were caught in their shelters when the barrage lifted and French soldiers appeared through the smoke. The fighting was sharp but relatively brief. By afternoon, French colonial troops, Moroccans fighting with particular distinction, had reached Fort Douaumont. German defenders, trapped in the fort's deep chambers, had little choice but to surrender. By evening, the tricolor flew once again over Douaumont's ruins, and French guns were firing in celebration. The recapture of Douaumont was a moment of immense symbolic importance for France. The fortress that had been lost so humiliatingly in February was retaken in October, demonstrating that French arms could achieve victory, that the months of defensive fighting had not been in vain, that determination and proper method could overcome German strength. The news was celebrated throughout France. Church bells rang as they had not since the war's beginning. Newspapers published special editions. Politicians gave speeches about French resolve and coming victory. For the soldiers who had endured Verdun, the recapture of Douaumont was proof that their suffering had purpose, that they had held long enough for victory to be possible. On November 2nd, a second French offensive recaptured Fort Vaux, evacuated by German forces who withdrew rather than be trapped. The recovery of Vaux was less dramatic than Douaumont's recapture, but no less significant. The two great forts, lost in spring and early summer, were French again by early November. With them came thousands of meters of recaptured ground. The French line pushed forward almost to where it had stood in February when the battle began. 10 months of fighting had produced a situation remarkably similar to where it started, but at costs that defied comprehension. Chapter 18. December, the End. December brought the final French offensive of the year, launched on December 15th with objectives of capturing additional ground and definitively ending the German threat to Verdun. This attack achieved its objectives, pushing German forces back further, capturing thousands of prisoners, demonstrating continued French offensive capability. By mid-December, the French line was in places slightly ahead of where it had been before the battle began. The German offensive that was to have bled France white had failed. The German army had been bled as heavily as the French, and the strategic situation on the Western Front was unchanged. On December 18th, the last major German counterattack was beaten off by French fire. After that, the battle gradually died down, not with any formal ending or armistice, but simply through exhaustion and the onset of winter, and the mutual understanding that nothing more could be gained that year. Artillery fire continued, men continued to die, but the Great Battle of Verdun, 303 days of hell, was over. It had not decided the war. It had not achieved its objectives for either side. It had simply consumed men and resources and time, a vast expenditure that left both nations weaker and the outcome of the war still uncertain. Chapter 19. Counting the Cost. The casualties at Verdun defy easy summary. The numbers themselves are uncertain, lost in the chaos of battle and the imprecision of record-keeping under combat conditions. French casualties are generally estimated at around 377,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. German casualties were somewhat lower, perhaps 336,000, though some estimates range higher. Combined, the two nations lost over 700,000 men at Verdun, a number that approaches abstraction, that becomes meaningless through its very magnitude. 700,000 individuals, each with a name and family and life, simply removed from existence or permanently damaged in body and mind. These numbers tell only part of the story. They do not convey what it meant to individual families across France and Germany when the telegram arrived or the letter came reporting that a son or husband or father was dead or missing or gravely wounded. They do not account for the men who survived physically but were broken mentally, who returned home unable to sleep without nightmares, unable to endure sudden noises, unable to adjust to civilian life after months in hell. They do not measure the collective trauma inflicted on the French and German nations.
the sense that something fundamental had been broken, that the world before 1914 was gone forever, replaced by something darker and more terrible. The physical landscape of Verdun was transformed beyond recognition. The hills and forests and villages that had existed before the battle were simply gone, replaced by a cratered wasteland where nothing grew and nothing could grow for years to come. The soil was poisoned by explosives and gas, saturated with metal fragments and unexploded shells. Entire villages had disappeared, their locations marked only by signs erected after the war. The forests were dead, every tree shattered or burned, the ground beneath them churned into powder. It would take decades for nature to begin reclaiming this land, for grass and scrub to grow again, for new forests to cover the scars. The Zone Rouge, the Red Zone, was the name given to areas around Verdun and other major battlefields where the devastation was so complete that the French government forbade habitation and farming. These areas were simply too contaminated, too dangerous, too physically altered to be reclaimed for civilian use. Over the decades, some of the Red Zone has been gradually reclassified as safe, but large areas around Verdun remain off-limits more than a century later. Unexploded shells are still found regularly by farmers and construction workers, each discovery requiring evacuation and disposal by military bomb disposal units. The war still kills, occasionally, when a shell detonates during removal or when someone disturbs ordnance that has lain dormant for decades. The human remains are still there as well, beneath the surface. Despite massive efforts after the war to locate and bury the dead, hundreds of thousands of bodies were never found, simply disappeared in the explosions that obliterated everything, buried too deep to be recovered, scattered beyond identification. Every year, construction or erosion uncovers bones, fragments of uniforms, identification tags. These remains are gathered and, when possible, identified through modern forensic techniques. When identification is impossible, they are buried in the ossuary at Douaumont, joining the tens of thousands already there. Chapter 20, Memories and Memorials. The Douaumont ossuary, completed in 1932, stands on the battlefield where Fort Douaumont once dominated the landscape. It is a massive structure, a granite tower and long galleries built to hold the bones of the unidentified dead from both French and German armies. Within its walls rest the remains of approximately 130,000 soldiers, arranged in burial vaults along the building's length. Visitors can look through small windows set into the base of the building and see the bones stacked within, femurs and skulls and ribs of men whose names are lost but whose sacrifice is remembered. The ossuary's design is deliberately solemn, a place for reflection rather than glorification. Its central tower rises like a sword thrust into the ground or a shell standing on end, depending on one's interpretation. Inside, lists of the dead cover the walls, names organized by regiment and battle, an overwhelming catalog of loss. A chapel provides space for contemplation and prayer. Outside, a cemetery holds the graves of 15,000 identified French soldiers, their white crosses arranged in precise rows on grass that is kept perpetually green, a stark contrast to the destroyed landscape that surrounded them for years after the war. Other memorials dot the Verdun battlefield. Each village that was destroyed has a small monument marking where it stood. Trench systems have been preserved in places, their zigzag lines still visible in the forest that has grown over them. Fort Douaumont and Fort Vaux are open to visitors, their deep corridors and chambers restored to give some sense of what soldiers experienced there. The Trench of Bayonets, where French soldiers were supposedly buried alive by shell fire with only their bayonets protruding from the ground, is preserved, though the story itself is likely more legend than fact. Throughout the battlefield, signs and markers tell the story of different phases of the battle, different units that fought there, different moments in the 303 days. The French commemorations of Verdun have emphasized sacrifice, endurance, and national unity. Verdun became France's battle, the place where the nation proved it could withstand anything, where ordinary Frenchmen demonstrated extraordinary courage. The phrase "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass, became a national motto, a declaration of resolve that extended beyond military matters to encompass French identity and values. School children learned about Verdun as a defining moment in French history. Veterans of the battle were honored, their experience recognized as exceptional even among the exceptional suffering of the Great War.
Germany's memory of Verdun is more complex, marked by the recognition that the battle was a strategic failure that cost Germany dearly and achieved nothing substantial. German memorials at Verdun are fewer and more restrained, acknowledging sacrifice but not celebrating the battle. For Germans, Verdun represents the futility of Falkenhayn's strategy, the waste of men in an offensive that was supposed to bleed France white but instead bled Germany almost as badly. It represents part of the larger tragedy of the First World War, a conflict that Germany lost and that led to national humiliation and the conditions that would produce the Second World War. For both nations, Verdun has become a place of reconciliation as well as remembrance. French and German leaders have met there to commemorate the battle and to symbolize the friendship between nations that were once enemies. The most famous such meeting was in 1984, when French President François Mitterrand and German Chancellor Helmut Kohl stood together at Douaumont, holding hands in a gesture of reconciliation that was broadcast around the world. These commemorations emphasize peace, unity, and the determination that such a battle must never be repeated. Chapter 21. What Verdun Means. Verdun occupies a unique place in the history of the First World War and in military history more broadly. It was not the war's largest battle in terms of frontage or forces engaged. The Somme was larger, as were the great battles on the Eastern Front. It did not decide the war's outcome. The stalemate on the Western Front continued after Verdun much as before. It did not represent any particular tactical or technological innovation. The methods used there were refinements of techniques developed elsewhere. What made Verdun unique was its duration, its concentration, and its symbolic weight. For 303 days, on a relatively small piece of ground, two great armies fought each other to exhaustion without achieving a decision. The battle became an end in itself, detached from larger strategic goals, a test of national will and human endurance. Falkenhayn's original plan to bleed France white through a battle of attrition evolved into mutual attrition that damaged both armies. The question was no longer who could win, but who could last, who could continue feeding men into the meat grinder, who would break first. In the end, neither broke. Both endured. The battle simply stopped when exhaustion and events elsewhere made continuation pointless. Verdun demonstrated the fundamental problem of First World War warfare, the advantage of defense over offense in an age of rapid-fire weapons and elaborate fortifications. Artillery could destroy positions but could not hold them. Infantry could advance but could not advance quickly enough to exploit breaches before defenders arrived. The result was stalemate. Battles that consumed vast resources and lives without producing decisive results. Verdun was this stalemate distilled to its essence, made pure and terrible. The human cost of Verdun represents industrialized warfare taken to its logical extreme. The battle consumed men the way a factory consumes raw materials, processing them through a system designed to produce death. The comparison is not metaphorical. The artillery barrages, the rotation of units, the supply systems, the medical evacuation procedures, all were industrial processes applied to warfare. Men entered the battle as individuals and emerged, if they emerged at all, as casualties, statistics, numbers in reports. The Industrial Revolution that had brought such progress and prosperity in the 19th century was turned toward destruction in the 20th, and Verdun showed the results. Yet within this industrial horror, individual courage and human connection persisted. Soldiers endured Verdun not through ideology or hatred of the enemy, but through bonds with comrades, through small acts of kindness and humor, through the determination to do their duty and not let others down. They found ways to maintain their humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. They wrote letters, shared food, helped wounded comrades, continued to care about ordinary things even as they lived through extraordinary horror. This capacity for endurance, for maintaining human connection amid mass death, is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Verdun story. The futility of Verdun's outcome, 10 months of fighting to end approximately where it began, has made it a symbol of the First World War's larger futility.
The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas 1914 dragged on for 4 years. The massive battles that were supposed to produce decisive breakthroughs produced only stalemate and slaughter. The victory, when it finally came in 1918, did not bring the peace and security that had been promised, but rather set the stage for an even more terrible war 20 years later.
Verdun, in retrospect, seems to encapsulate all of this: the enormous sacrifice, the determination to endure, and ultimately the question of what it all meant, what it achieved, whether it was worth the cost. For the soldiers who fought there and survived, Verdun was simply an experience that marked them forever. They carried it with them the rest of their lives, in nightmares and memories, in wounds visible and invisible. They rarely spoke of it in detail, finding that those who had not been there could not understand, that language failed to convey what they had experienced. They gathered occasionally, the survivors, at reunions and commemorations, finding in each other's company the understanding that civilians could not provide. As the years passed and the veterans aged and died, their memories died with them, leaving only the written accounts and photographs and monuments to tell what happened on those hills above the Meuse River in 1916. The fields around Verdun today are peaceful and green, covered in forest and grass where once there was only cratered mud. The Meuse River flows as it always has, its waters clean and clear, reflecting sky and trees. Villages have been rebuilt, roads paved, farms established. Life has returned to the landscape that was so thoroughly devastated more than a century ago. But beneath the surface, the war remains. Unexploded shells and human remains, metal fragments and chemical residues. The physical evidence of what happened here embedded in the earth itself. Visitors to Verdun today can walk the battlefield, visit the monuments, descend into the preserved forts, and see the dark corridors where men lived and died. They can stand at the Douaumont ossuary and look out over the cemetery and the battlefield beyond, trying to imagine what occurred here, trying to understand the scale of the killing and the courage of those who endured it. Most find it difficult. The peaceful landscape resists understanding, refuses to yield its secrets to those who see it only in tranquility. The imagination balks at populating these quiet fields with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, at filling the air with shell fire, at accepting that this pleasant countryside was once the most dangerous place on earth. The memorial sites do their work quietly, without drama or excessive explanation. They present the facts, the dates, the names, the numbers. They preserve the physical evidence, the trenches, the forts, the shell holes. They provide space for reflection without directing what that reflection should conclude. Visitors are left to draw their own meanings, to make their own sense of what happened here, to decide for themselves what Verdun means in the larger context of history and human experience. What can be said with certainty is that Verdun tested the limits of human endurance and found that those limits were higher than anyone had imagined. Men lived through conditions that should have broken them, and yet continued to function, to fight, to maintain their humanity. This is not to glorify war or to suggest that such suffering is ennobling. The suffering at Verdun was waste on a massive scale, lives destroyed for objectives that proved meaningless, courage expended in a cause that achieved nothing decisive. But within that waste and futility, individual humans demonstrated a capacity for endurance that demands recognition and respect. The soldiers who fought at Verdun, French and German both, were ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They were farmers and factory workers, teachers and clerks, young men who should have been beginning their adult lives in peace, but who instead found themselves in hell. They did not choose this war or plan this battle. They were simply there, doing what their nations asked of them, enduring what had to be endured. Their experience was particular to their time and place, yet it speaks to something universal about human nature: the capacity to endure suffering, to maintain hope in hopeless situations, to find meaning in experiences that seem meaningless. As you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps you can hold in your mind an image of the Verdun battlefield as it is now: quiet, green, peaceful. The monuments stand watch over the dead. The forests grow where forests were destroyed. The Meuse River flows eternally onward.
The scars are healing, though slowly, though incompletely. The men who fought there are gone now, all of them, the last veterans having passed away decades ago. But their memory remains, preserved in stone and earth and the records they left behind, asking not to be glorified but simply to be remembered, to have their sacrifice acknowledged even if its purpose remains forever unclear. The Battle of Verdun lasted 303 days, but its echoes continue more than a century later.
It reminds us of the costs of war, the limits of violence as a solution to conflict, the value of human life and human courage. It stands as a warning from the past about what can happen when nations commit fully to destroying each other, when industrial capacity is turned toward death, when the momentum of violence becomes impossible to stop. And it stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the capacity to endure and to hope, even in the darkest circumstances. As sleep comes, let these thoughts settle gently in your mind. The story of Verdun is heavy with sorrow and loss, but it is also, in its way, a story of hope. The soldiers endured, the land recovered. Nations that were once enemies became friends. The monuments stand not only to remember the dead, but to celebrate peace, to remind us that the alternative to peace is what happened at Verdun, 303 days of hell that no one should ever have to experience again. Rest now, in the peace that those soldiers never knew during those terrible months in 1916. Their struggle is over, their sacrifice is remembered, and the fields of Verdun, once the site of humanity's worst impulses, are now places of quiet reflection, gardens of remembrance where the grass grows green and the monuments stand silent watch over the ground that absorbed so much suffering and somehow, eventually, found peace. Sleep well.